Healthcare's forgotten patients. Millions of Americans left to languish in prison or survive without treatment on the street. As the nation struggles to reform healthcare, who's fighting on behalf of the mentally ill in America?
A young man, homeless and schizophrenic, beaten to death, kicked, tasered multiple times, hogtied face down, smashed against concrete, his head slammed with a flashlight.
The mentally ill are more likely to be the victim of a violent crime than the perpetrator.
Hello and welcome to the Guy Boudreaux Radio Show. I'm Guy Boudreaux. Today's topic is going to be mental illness. And the interesting part about this particular show is the fact that if you're mentally ill, it's not like having a broken leg or having surgery and being able to visibly see bruises from that surgery. It's about the fact that when you're mentally ill, you look totally fine. And you really are going to be pretty amazed and shocked at the current system in place that is designed to not necessarily protect the mentally ill, but to push them under the rug and away from society. So without further ado, I'd like to bring in Dr. Aron Steward to the show. Dr. Aron Steward has worked in maximum security prisons throughout the United States, and she is very active, or has been very active, in the Los Angeles, California area in regards to working with not only the prison system, but with law enforcement agencies, etc. So again, let's bring in Aron Steward, and I really do think you're going to find out some disturbing facts about how we are currently dealing with the mentally ill here in the United States. Dr. Aron Steward, I'd like to welcome you to the Guy Boudreaux Radio Show. Let's start the show off by asking the simple question, at least I think it's a simple question: where does someone go if they are mentally ill?
Well, first of all, Guy, thank you so much for having me on the show. I just want to say firstly that I really appreciate it and that I think it's a good move. I think we need to talk about this as much as possible so that we can solve the problem, right, and protect the people that are mentally ill from different systems that they shouldn't end up in. So your question really has a lot of answers, and the first answer is it depends on what type of mental illness they have and what type of behavior they're doing, and also how many resources they have and what their family knows. So unfortunately, the way the system works now is that if the family knows a lot, then the person with mental illness can go places that are safe and also treatment-oriented. And if the family doesn't know very much, people with mental illness these days are going to jail. So, because
not to interrupt you, but you know the interesting thing about what you're talking about is, well, a lot of families are embarrassed to talk about it because mental illness is not something that you can see.
Right.
And so, how would you bridge that gap between educating family or friends in regards to coping with mental illness?
Right. So what I always tell people, and I started out as a prison psychologist and then most recently working on the street with people that are suicidal and homicidal to protect them from doing whatever it was that they were going to do. Whenever I talk to families, I always tell them that even though there's stigma, even though there's shame that the society has given to families, even though it's hard to talk about it, the best and most important thing to do in order to keep the family's loved ones safe and in the right place is to talk about it. Because what ultimately ends up happening is that when police interact with someone who's mentally ill, if they don't know that there's mental illness there, they're going to behave like police do, which is that they're going to try to keep everybody safe, and they're going to, worry about threats, they're going to worry about violence, and they're going to take the person where police take people, which is to, precincts and to jail and to all of those places. And so that's what police do. So unless police know that the person is mentally ill or has a history of mental illness, they can't respond accordingly. And so when I talk to families, I always tell them that even though it's hard, even though you don't want to talk about it, even though you don't want to talk to police about it, even though you want to talk to strangers about it, the most safety that we can bring for people that have mental illness is to talk about it. And when I say talk about it, I mean from the very beginning. I try to teach people with mental illness that that's what they need to say. This is my diagnosis. This is my history. This is what has happened to me. This is what I've done. I need treatment. I don't need to go to jail. I need treatment. I need help. And the family to say the same thing from the beginning.
Well, what happens if that family member that is diagnosed with a mental illness doesn't want the help? And what happens when they just flat out refuse to take the medication that will ultimately make them better? I mean, how do you bridge that gap as well? I mean, how does that all play out?
Right. And that happens a lot, and it happens disproportionately even more with certain diagnoses. So certain diagnoses lend themselves to paranoia, and they lend themselves to people not feeling like they want treatment, that they're resistant. So often we see people with bipolar disorder really resistant to medication because they feel uncomfortable with evening out. They feel more comfortable with the ups and the downs, the personality traits that they get from that experience. And often we see people with, diagnoses of psychoses as having also some paranoia and being really afraid of mental health treatment, being really afraid of strangers, and going to different facilities and being treated. And so resistance was often pathologized in the late 80s, early 90s, where therapists and mental health treatment providers said, oh, well, that client's resistant. Oh, well, there's nothing we can do for that client. They don't want treatment. But what we're knowing now and what we're doing now is we're really trying to engage the client, because what we know is without the client's consent, it doesn't work. Treatment doesn't work. And the only way that we can provide them treatment without their consent is if they're at imminent risk for harm to self or others. And what that means is if they're going to hurt themselves or somebody else, we can treat them without consent. And we can send them to the inpatient psychiatric hospital on a hold so that they're safe and so everybody else is safe. But if they are not at risk to themselves or others, in the immediate future, we can't treat them without their consent. And so in every other situation, other than them trying to kill themselves or somebody else, we have to get them on board. And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of explanation. It takes a lot of somebody going there to that client over and over and over and letting them know that they're safe before they consent. And the issue is that our system doesn't have that time, and it doesn't have that energy, it doesn't have those funding dollars. And so often that falls on the family to explain to the client over and over and over that these people are safe, this system is safe, we want you to get help and it's going to be okay. When you get treated, you're going to feel better. Often that falls on the family, and if there's a lot of stigma in the family, that's where the obstacle is.
Right. It sounds like that,
right.
But that can be a very long revolving door for the families, even if they are at risk.
It's a very long door. Yeah.
Yeah. So where do you is there ultimately a cure for mental illness?
Well, so that's a really hard question, and I don't think we really know the answer yet. It's also a complicated question, and I think there's more than one answer. So there are good prognoses for some diagnoses, and there's more difficult and challenging prognoses for other diagnoses. But what I always say to families and to clients and to colleagues is that we have to instill hope. Otherwise, it's not a good prognosis. No matter what diagnosis it is, no matter what situation it is, no matter whether the family has resources or not, if we do not instill hope that there is a way to get better, it's not going to happen, because people have to be on board, and they're not going to be on board unless we give them a nugget of this is going to get better, you're going to feel better, the family is going to be better. But to be honest, some diagnoses are harder to treat. Just by their nature, they're harder to treat. So Also, the other thing that complicates the situation is if a client with a mental health diagnosis is also using drugs or alcohol, then that adds a different layer onto the treatment regimen because you have to treat both. You have to treat the substance use, and they also have to treat the mental health diagnoses. And we're not, as a field, really sure yet which to treat first and how to treat both at the same time. I mean, we have some ways of doing it, but it's a struggle. And so that complicates situations. And so I always tell families that if your loved one is clean and sober, there's a better prognosis, and we have to address both. And what else complicates the situations is if mental illness has caused a client to be homeless or caused a client to be concerned about interacting with their family and they're not in touch with any loved ones. That complicates things a lot. But I feel and I believe that there's hope for every person that is struggling with mental illness in this current phase of their life. I feel that there's hope, and I feel that there's change that can be made, even if there's small victories. There's always change that can be made that brings safety to a situation and keeps a person safe. So yes, absolutely, everything is treatable. Every mental health diagnosis is treatable, and it matters, what the complicated system is to figure out whether there's going to be a good ending.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk.
Yeah.
Let's segue back into law enforcement. Are law enforcement officers trained to handle a mentally ill suspect?
It depends. It depends on what area of the country they're in, what state they're in, what county they're in, what neighborhood they're in, what block they work on. It depends on the personality of the officer who's responding. So we can train police officers till we're blue in the face. And ultimately, at the end of the day, matters what kind of cop is being trained and what their personality is, what their life experience is, whether they absorb that training or not. But I will say this, that we are training police officers on a regular basis now, especially in LA County. In LA County, they're at the forefront of training police officers to deal with people with mental illness. And in fact, in LA County, mental health providers are going with law enforcement to respond to a mental health patient. They're teaming with law enforcement and responding at the same time. And that's the cutting edge. That is what all over the country people are looking towards as the future of response for mental health, is a team between a law enforcement agent who is dressed in civilian clothes and a civilian mental health provider who goes with them and has a plethora of experience and knowledge about what to do. Now, in the small towns of the United States, this is absolutely not happening, and also the officers are not always trained. And I think, it matters about funding. It matters about what the county and what the state has put their funding towards, and it matters about what we know in those areas about what prevents violence. And law enforcement by nature for many, many years has felt like safety first, and safety first sometimes means restraining a mentally ill person without concerning themselves as to what that mental illness is doing in terms of making their behavior the way that it is and what it's going to do when a law enforcement agent puts their hands on somebody. There's not always been a lot of emphasis placed on that. But these days, it really is becoming the forefront of the push for law enforcement to be trained on how to deal with mental illness, because there's been a lot of cases where it's been highly profile, high media cases where mentally ill people struggling with mental illness, have been addressed by law enforcement and have been harmed, and because there was no protocol. So it is a big deal now, but in LA County is cutting edge, and cities are cutting edge. But in the country of the United States, in the smaller rural towns, they don't have anything yet. They really don't.
So having said all of that, is there a system in place, if I arrest a mentally ill person and I get their, I'm now aware of their background, etc.
Yeah.
Now, if I have to get called back to that general area and I'm going to deal with the same perp who I know is now mentally ill,
right.
Will that show up in the system so that before I arrive to the scene, I know what I'm dealing with? Do we have a system in place like that now, even in LA or anywhere in the U.S.?
Yeah, so again, it depends on the state and the jurisdiction. In LA County, LAPD has access to, so what happens is in some counties, the Department of Mental Health, once the police department knows that one of their clients or whoever they're responding to has a mental health history, the Department of Mental Health sometimes will put a flag on a patient, or the police department will put a flag on a patient, meaning that they're a mental health patient and that they have a long history of mental health. And in LA County, what that means is the police department will call the Department of Mental Health and will team with a mental health unit and go out and see that patient. If there are no mental health units available, and that sometimes happens because the mental health units are very, very busy, if there is no team, the law enforcement teams will go out, do the very best that they can with their training of what to do with mental health patients, and take the person, depending on their behavior and depending on their history, take the person to a psychiatric ER instead of to jail. And that's best case scenario. If there's no mental health team and the police are the ones that respond and they have a long mental health history, taking them to an ER for evaluation is the best case scenario, because then they'll see a psychiatrist and they'll be evaluated for safety and where they need to go and treatment recommendations and all of that. If they end up in jail, which often does happen, if they end up in jail, it's not a good situation, because they are in a holding cell for 24 hours, sometimes more, sometimes less, but often it's 24 hours with a lot of other inmates. And that is where there's risk for aggression and violence, suicide, further charges to those people that have mental illness, because they're sitting in a holding cell with many other inmates. And sometimes, inmates that are very successful criminals. And so that is what we want to prevent. We want to prevent that first entry to jail, or the many after entry to jail. But we want to prevent that because it doesn't really go well for mental health patients ever.
I did a little research in regards to the mentally ill that are currently incarcerated. And I looked at a study that was done back in 2006. And in 2006, this particular study stated that there were over 760,000 mentally ill individuals doing hard time.
Yeah. So right now in our country, we have 7 million people who are a part of the correctional system. And that is probationary, that's community supervision, that's county and state and all of that stuff, 7 million people. And in any given facility, the usually accepted number of mentally ill people in any given correctional facility or on any given probationary or community service situation is between 20 and 40%. And that varies because of gender, but it also varies because of, the demographics of that area, but also it varies because of the people in the facility that are documenting whether somebody's mentally ill or not. So some of the treatment providers in county jail or in state prison or whatever are more lenient and are giving people mental health diagnosis on a more routine basis than other treatment providers. What we know is that if we have 2 treatment providers in jail see the same person, they're not going to come out with the same diagnosis and they're not going to come out with the same result. So there's not a similarity across the board. So on any given facility, it's between 20 and 40% that are diagnosed mentally ill in any correctional facility. So if you think about those numbers, it makes our prison population and our jail population the highest place that mentally ill people are treated in anywhere in the country. Those are our psychiatric hospitals now, are the jails and the prisons. And when I was working in prison, I was working with people that had very, very long histories and very serious diagnoses that would have at another time in our world been in long-term inpatient units, in long-term, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, long-term inpatient units, but are now in jail doing time, doing long, long sentences for things they did when they were off their meds or they were out of treatment. And so that's what we're treating in jail and in prison as mental health people, is very severe, persistent and chronic mental illness. Schizophrenia, psychosis, delusional disorder, all of that stuff is what we're treating, which used to be treated in inpatient psychiatric hospitals before the release to the community.
So how do we get back to that model? How do we push those numbers back to the psychiatric hospitals?
Well, so Guy, to be honest, I believe, and many, many psychologists believe, many psychiatrists believe, that when they signed that bill to release all of the severely and persistently chronically mentally ill people from long-term inpatient stays, when they signed that bill, they were truly doing it from a good place. They were trying to give people with mental illness a lot of rights to be out in the community. They were trying to give them community supervision and outpatient care in the community. What happened was, after they signed that bill and released the people from inpatient units, the services didn't follow. So the community services that were supposed to be put in place did not come to fruition. The money didn't come, the funding didn't settle, and those people never had the intensive community services that were supposed to be set up. So the system never caught up with the plan. And unfortunately, what happened over the last 20 years since that was the decision is those people that would have initially been placed in long-term inpatient care are now on the street, and they're in jail, and they're using substances because they're not being supervised, because they're mentally ill. And part of their mental illness is not being able to respond accordingly to people reaching out to them, right? Part of what I was talking about earlier is the paranoia and the resistance and the fear that is associated with mental illness. And so how do we get back to that model is a really hard question. We as a field have not been able to solve that problem. We don't know what to do because all of those people have caught charges. All of those people are under court supervision at this point. And so we don't know what to do. We don't know how to turn it around. The numbers that are going to jail and prison, they just dropped since 2 years ago. This was the first time that they dropped. They've been increasing and increasing and increasing and increasing to, numbers where our prisons can't hold them. Our jails can't hold them. They're holding double what they should be holding. And California, you probably know, California is the first state to try early release. And November was the first time that, they have to let 30,000 inmates go over a certain amount of time because that's what state is requiring them to do. And no other state has done that yet. And we don't know what's going to happen yet. We don't know what it's going to be like to release all of these people before they finish their sentences. And the Department of Mental Health is required to respond to all of those people. And there's just not enough services or funding like there never was before. And so the question that you ask is really, really hard. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to reinstate that system. And we don't even know if that's the right system to reinstate. All of the psychiatric hospitals have been closed down. So Metro State, which is in LA County, used to hold 3,000 patients before the bills were signed. Now there's between 400 and 600, and they stay for less than 30 days. And so those numbers, if you think about it, where are those other 2,400 people that would have been held in an inpatient unit? They're on the street or they're in jail, being treated as criminals, being treated as homeless people with drug addictions. But really and truly at the bottom of it, they have mental health problems.
Yeah, this is a very, very tough conversation because ultimately, I mean, where is the bottom? Ultimately, I mean,
Right.
because
Right.
there is a revolving door. When I hear you say that 30,000 inmates were released, ultimately I think to myself, well, how are they going to eat? Where are they going to sleep? And I've heard
Right.
horror stories about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, we had these health institutions were putting mentally ill individuals on a bus with a one-way ticket to certain cities around America.
Right.
And but again, where is the bottom? I mean, if the correctional institutions are the new mental hospitals, that's a huge problem, and
Right.
without any long-term solution or even short-term solutions.
Well, right, for lots of different reasons. So the first thing that has always jumped into my mind and which became, abundantly clear after working in the jail and the prison is that in the majority of the prisons and jails, the paradigm has always been the more violent a person, the more solitary confinement they receive, right? The more difficult and challenging they are, the less time they have to be social in the jail or in the prison. The problem with that in terms of mental illness is that what we know is that mental illness does not get better in solitary confinement. In fact, what we know is that from Eastern State Penitentiary in Philly, and that's a very interesting Google search and very interesting historical, search, is that Eastern State Penitentiary was the first place in the United States, and it was modeled after, Europe, and it was purely 100% solitary confinement. And that's the way the prison was built, and that was what the fundamental core of it. And what we found, the research, all of the findings was, it made people worse. It made people more mentally ill. It drove them to hear voices, to have obsessions and compulsions, to harm themselves. That's what it drove them to do. And so after that prison was built, we started turning a corner in this country and realizing that solitary confinement can really cause people to go in a worse direction. And so my concern with jails and prisons being the big treatment hospitals, the treatment facilities in our country, is that it's based on a correctional model where people are being punished. And what we know about mental illness is that we can't punish it out of people. That treatment is very different than punishment, and punishment does not work with mentally ill. And so the fundamental core model that prisons and jails are based on is not what treatment facilities are based on. It's not one and the same. And so my concern, my heart broke for the severely mentally ill women and men that I treated in the prison because I knew that they weren't receiving the treatment that is going to work. They were receiving both punishment, but also a thing called pulse checks. And that's the term that we coin in the prison system, as a therapist or a psychiatrist will go, quote, lay eyes on an inmate to make sure that they're not decompensating or getting worse. And that will be their treatment. That will be their treatment, is medicine, and for somebody to lay eyes on them twice a month. And that's not treatment. And so my concern is they're going to jail, they're going to prison, and they're coming out. And now they're coming out sooner because the jails are overpopulated, and they're coming out worse. The statistic is that if you do over a year of jail time, and most people do over a year, if you do over a year, you're likely 77% likely to go back within a year. And if you think about that in terms of our mental health patients, that is heartbreaking. They don't even stand a chance. Hardly anyone stands a chance, but certainly not somebody that's dealing with severe mental illness where they're hearing voices or they're paranoid or they're afraid to participate in society,
Well, tell me this, to that inmate that is out.
Yeah.
How if they aren't going to take their meds, because more than likely, if they're going to return to the prison system, it means that they're not getting the help that they need in regards to, one, the medication. If the medication is available to them, they don't think they need to take the medication. How do you convince someone that it's in their best interest to take this medication? And more than likely, at this point in their life, the relationship with their friends and family theoretically has diminished. So
Right.
where is that? How do you get that point across to somebody who's mentally ill? Because if they are schizophrenic, more than likely they are thinking that if you're trying to give them something, that more than likely you're trying to poison them. So
Right.
where is that? Is there a happy medium?
Yeah. So another really, really hard question that you're asking, and I think the answer, my personal opinion is the answer, is that before they leave any facility that they're in, I'm talking about people with, severe mental illness, before they leave the facility that they're in, there has to be a thread, a string attached to someone or something on the outside, a plan, a safety plan, a treatment plan, a provider that is waiting for them and ready to catch them. And what happens is that in at least in the prison that I worked in, that when release date came, sometimes because of miscommunication, sometimes because of apathy, sometimes because of a lot of different reasons, the message was not conveyed to anyone on the outside that an inmate with mental illness was being released. And so the inmates with mental illness were given the same thing that any inmate without mental illness were: $18, a pair of jeans, and a white shirt. And they were released. That was it.
That's incredible.
And if there is nothing ready to catch them, then immediately they go back to what they know, because human nature is to feel safe and familiar and to be caught by something that makes sense. Lots of times we choose even the known, even though it may be dangerous or bad, as opposed to the unknown. And so if there's not someone ready to provide them medicine, if there's not a clinic that they know they're supposed to go into right away, then they're left to their own devices and they come up with their own safety plan. And oftentimes that is to return to whatever environment or people they're used to the provider, without stopping anywhere, without passing go, without collecting any money, without stopping and saying hi to friends. They're going straight to their new clinic. And that is the best way that we found that protects them from losing the direction, from feeling isolated. And mental illness in lots of different diagnoses have the same component to them of isolation, the same component of lack of motivation. And so if we can motivate and get rid of that isolation right away, then they have a much better chance of sticking with it. But that is not happening a lot. It's not happening a lot. It's happening with our very, very severely mentally ill people, our very, very suicidal people. The prison is taking care of it, making an appointment, but it's not happening a lot because that costs a lot of money, it costs energy, it costs time, and it costs a treatment provider on the inside having the insight and energy to call somebody on the outside.
So what are some of can you talk about maybe some of the gut-wrenching, incidents that you've ran into while working within the prison system in terms of some of your clients, without giving names, et cetera, but just some of just kind of, give us maybe an overview of a few individuals, if you can.
Yeah. I think that and I came from a very small town, very small farm where there wasn't a lot of violence. And so my naivety was really, really strong. And I went in there feeling like, you know what, if we give people the right tools, if we give them what they need, they can get better. And what I found was, and I learned really quick, it was a steep learning curve, and it was very difficult, very challenging. But what I found was that people who end up in jail and prison have not very often had an easy life. Sometimes they have families on the outside that love them. Sometimes they have families that are still in contact. But the majority of them do not. And so the problem with that is that they have been through so many horrible things. But when they get to jail or prison, when they enter the courtroom for sentencing, when they do what they actually do, which is hurt somebody else or themselves or whatever, get themselves arrested, none of that matters. None of that matters. So no matter what somebody else has done to a person, it doesn't matter. Like, for example, I was treating this 22-year-old woman, and she had really, really, really hurt another person. She had taken a knife and really sliced up another female to the point where that female was going to die, and she felt nothing about it. And when we got down to the bottom of it, she felt nothing about it because she felt justified. That other female had harmed her family, and in her family, growing up as a child, the response to that, when somebody hurts your family, is that they die. And there was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's how she was trained. As a little girl, as a teenager, she was gang affiliated, and that's what they do. That is what she did, and that's what her family did. And it didn't matter in the end when she received 25 years to life. It didn't matter that this is her childhood. This is what was done to her. You know, repeatedly molested, repeatedly assaulted, repeatedly seeing her family take things into their own hands, not use the criminal justice system, repeatedly seeing violent incidents, lots of trauma history, and ending up doing the same thing, and none of that mattered. Because in the end, when she's standing in the courtroom and she's answering to her sentence, the judge said, it doesn't matter why you did it, because you took somebody's life, or you tried to take somebody's life. It doesn't matter why you did it. It doesn't matter whether you're depressed or have trauma or any of that stuff. We're sentencing you as what society has said you deserve. And I feel like that was what kept happening over and over and over for me, is that I would be sitting in front of women or men who ended up in prison, and sometimes they got clean and sober in prison and realized what they had done. I treated a lot of women who had killed their own children in psychosis when they're off their medicine, and you send them to prison or jail, you give them life, you give them medicine, and they clear up, and they realize what they've done. And they have the rest of their life to think about the fact that they harmed their own children. They killed their own children in a fit of psychosis, untreated. And there's nothing that can be done about that after they're given their sentence, after they're already in jail or prison. And, you know, as a society, we don't know what to do about that, because we don't know how to let those people off, because we can't let them off because they've done something that is, you know, horrible and atrocious, and this is what we said that our society does to those people. So we don't know what to do, but once they get to prison, they have the rest of their life to sit there and think about what they've done, and on our taxpayers' dollars. So in general, it costs about $19,000 a year to keep somebody in an inpatient psychiatric hospital. In prison, it costs on average about $37,000 a year to keep them in prison. And so we're keeping them in a place that's not treating them, not making them better, not providing them with the services for a much higher amount of money than somewhere that would treat them, so, and keep them safe. So I think, you know, it's a major broken system that is just absolutely heartbreaking. And the thing is that it's not just bad for the inmates. It's bad for the correctional officers. The correctional officers, when I was working in the prison, I was there 4 years. We had suicides. We had correctional officers that left work and were never able to work again. We had correctional officers that died of liver, disease because they were alcoholics. We had correctional officers that, drove their cars into trees by accident or for not, because of the amount of stress that they were under. Correctional officers that formed sexual relationships with inmates. And all of that is the environment of a system that's broken. It's not just the inmates that are suffering. It's not just the mentally ill inmates. It's not just the families. It's the correctional officers, the mental health staff, the teachers, and the people on the outside who are victimized by those people, by the perpetrators, and those perpetrators come out and the families still feel victimized. Nobody is feeling better. Nobody is feeling better. When I was treating the women in prison, I treated 167 women that were labeled the most violent and dangerous in the prison. And as I recall, one out of the 167 really, truly changed her life, really, truly turned her life around. And that was good enough for me. One was good enough for me, but that's not good enough numbers. That's far too many women and men that are coming out that are not better. And I think, that we just have to do something about it. We just have to.
Ultimately, every ending has a beginning. And give me your opinion about, if you look at a child residing in a very upscale neighborhood or community, they are more than likely going to get that when they are flagged for a mental evaluation, they're gonna get that, and theoretically it will lead to them getting the help that they need in regards to any onset of mental illness. But if you look at a child in a poor community, more than likely they might get that same mental evaluation after a crime has been committed, or they may never get it at all until they end up in a correctional facility. So where is that? I'll even back up a little bit. Look at the what happened to those children in it was Sandy, I believe it was Sandy Hook Elementary School. Mm-hmm. The perpetrator came from a very upscale family, and as it turns out, at least the hearsay from what I'm hearing is that the mother, over a period of years, pretty much browbeat the kid to the point of not feeling good about himself. And whether he had schizophrenia or whether he had any other type of mental illness that those two put together was obviously a ticking time bomb. But how can we as a society catch those kids before something tragic happens, or anybody for that matter? Are there any signs? What's your take on that?
Well, so the first thing that I want to say, Guy, in response to the discussion about Sandy Hook, is that I think what we need to do, and this is a big need to do, it's, unbelievably hard to do, but what we need to do is we need to be very careful about the combination between mental illness and weapons, access to weapons. And we actually need to be very, very careful about the combination between weapons and somebody that's struggling, not necessarily somebody that has mental illness. But weapons in and of themselves do not harm people. But what we have to be really careful about is that we have to make sure that we're screening people and preventing people that are having a very, very hard time from harming somebody else by having access and means to harm somebody else. So in terms of your question, what do we do? I think what we do is what I learned in the prison and being on the streets from responding to people that have made very, very serious threats towards themselves or somebody else is that, and when I train clinicians about what to do in terms of reducing threat, is that I always talk about your gut. And people always giggle and laugh when I say it's about your gut, because it seems so simplistic and cliche. But what I've found is that the biggest indicator of whether there's safety is the long time ago Neanderthal, wired mechanism inside of our stomach that lets us know when there's danger. And I think that this is a two-part response. The first is that we have to pay attention to what is going on in our stomach. We have to pay attention to what is going on in our heart, and we have to know that if something doesn't feel right, if somebody doesn't look okay, if somebody's saying things that are making us fearful, if somebody's doing behaviors that are scary, we have to pay attention to that. And the second part of that is that if that is occurring, we have to let somebody know. And we cannot stay quiet. We can, in this day and age when there's weapons all over our country, kids have access to weapons, we can buy weapons online from other countries, we can put guns together by pieces that we purchase online. When weapons are this available, we have to do something if we get scared by somebody else's actions. And when I train kids on anti-bullying campaigns, and when I train kids on what to do if you see another child being harmed, without fail, a kid always raises their hand and they say, well, I don't want to be a snitch. And I think that is a big deal, that we don't want to tattle on other people because people have the right to live lives as they choose. People are allowed to be free. They're allowed to do what they want to do. But the problem is that if somebody is doing something that's unsafe, and that happens a lot these days, we have to get the authorities involved. We have to let somebody know. We have to tell the truth. We have to say, listen, I don't know whether this is going on. I don't know what's going on, but this person is scaring me. So that if we can give that person help, that we can get that person help and possibly prevent something from happening. I think those are the two most important ways that we can prevent, is that we must pay attention to what's going on. We must get off our cell phones. We must get off the computers. We must get off the distracted train and focus on what's going on around us. Pay attention to our gut. And then if something's not right, we have to let somebody know so that that person can get help. You know
what's another interesting thing about America, or most of the world, I think, is that when you take notice, for instance, the actress Amanda Bynes, she's a well-known actress, but the media is more focused on all of her shenanigans and her weird behavior as if it's a form of entertainment, and they are not going out of their way to get this young lady any help.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Guy, because I have to tell you that watching that whole thing unfold, I felt very, very sad about what we are doing as a country, and I thought it was an indicator of how we handle mental illness. Sometimes we just look away, but sometimes we really stare at it, and we really are interested in it and are curious about it and laugh about it. Sometimes we really don't provide help. Instead, we just let the person do whatever they're doing because we think it's interesting. And I did not think what she was doing was interesting at all. I did not think that it was curious or funny or should be portrayed in the media as, look at this girl, look at what she's doing. I did not think it was interesting. I thought it was a demonstration of someone suffering. And I don't mean that she was in pain. I mean that people do not have to live the way that she was living, where she was scared and paranoid and freaking out and misunderstood and all of those things. That's not necessary. Whenever I deal with somebody who has mental illness, I tell them, you can feel better. You don't have to feel like this. You can choose a different way. And I feel like we are obligated to give people options. And, filming them or putting them out on a pedestal and people gathering around and watching is not an option. Somebody was going to have to write a psychiatric hold on her. Somebody was going to have to, because that's the direction she was headed in, to protect her and to protect other people. And she was crying out for help over and over and over and over again. And the response that was given was, you're intriguing, you're interesting, let's watch you. And it's to me, it's not okay. It's not okay to not offer help to somebody that is really struggling to know what to do.
Yeah, no, I'm embarrassed for the American public when we do that, and the media. Now, I have to ask this question, and that is, at the end of the day, what jobs are out there for somebody that is mentally ill?
Yeah, great question. That's a great question. I think so. So that's a two-part question. The first is, what jobs are out there for people with mental illness that have a record? And that question, the answer, I think, is devastating. I think there are few to none for people that have mental illness and also have a record, because what happens is employers don't want to hire somebody with a record, especially if their behavior in the current moment is odd or strange or different or in some way indicates that they may have mental illness. That's two strikes again. And adding race to that card makes that getting a job very, very, very hard. But people that have mental illness, I think it's a little bit easier if you don't have a record. But what we're finding is that most people that have mental illness that went untreated for a certain amount of time got arrested, or they went to jail, or they got picked up because they did something they shouldn't have done. And so it's more and more prevalent to find people that have severe mental health diagnoses that also have records, as happening all the time these days. But in terms of companies that support people with mental illness, the Salvation Army and Goodwill, I always give money to them because of their specific relationship with hiring people that have histories of mental illness. They're very vocal about it. They do it very often. They have a huge support system, and it's working well for them. And so I always try to support those companies. Also, Walmart and Target and local grocery stores are a great place to support, because all of those places often will hire people with histories of mental illness or current issues with mental illness, like developmental disabilities or mental retardation or something like that. So I think it's very important to support those companies. The problem is that not many people are hiring people with mental illness. Not many people are.
So now, does that mean that the person that is diagnosed with a certain form of mental illness is eligible for disability? I mean,
okay.
They have to
so
eat.
That's also interesting. Yeah. So that depends on state and also county in terms of what diagnoses are allowed to be given disability insurance. But the severe and chronic diagnoses, schizophrenia, all of the bipolar disorders, all of the very severely life-impairing disorders are eligible for disability insurance, disability compensation, SSI. They are eligible. But again, that system, as we know it, just like any other system in the country, is classist in that if you don't know about it or somebody doesn't help you get there, it is very hard for a person with mental illness to figure that system out. And so social workers and department representatives and resources, those are the people that link people with mental illness. So that has to happen in the inpatient hospitals. That has to happen in the jails, where those people get linked to SSI and disability. But that doesn't always happen because people are strapped and the resources are strapped, and it doesn't always happen. But yes, they are eligible, and I have found that that is the best way for people with mental illness to get back on their feet, is to get a little bit of funding so that they can either live in an assisted living environment or a residential community or something like that, get a little bit of money, get back on their feet, get safe, get treatment, and then they can get started. Because when you have no money and you're mentally ill, you sell drugs or you sell yourself or you do something to get money. Money is very important because money is food. And so I think giving people with mental illness some money and some support and some housing is the first step. And so, yes, they are eligible, yes.
You know, another interesting point, and then we can wrap up the show, is that it's
Sure.
it's so amazing to me that the only time the general public pays attention to the mentally ill is when something drastic happens. Case scenario.
That's right.
About 4 months ago, a gentleman he walked into a 7-Eleven store, and prior to exiting his vehicle, he was asked by a homeless gentleman in his early 30s if he, could spare a dime, etc. Well, the short story is the gentleman snubbed him. He went into 7-Eleven, made a purchase, got back into his car, and was doused by gasoline by the 31-year-old mentally ill individual and died. He set the guy on fire, essentially. So... I always say to individuals that are talking to anybody who is in or who is homeless, etc., to at least be respectful and to look them in the eye and to let them know that they're there, because it can end very tragic if you don't pay attention to your surroundings in regards to someone that is impaired mentally. Another situation where a young lady was on break from work, and her and a girlfriend were walking on I forgot what street it was in L.A., but it was near a very touristy type of an area. And a gentleman was holding up a sign that said, "Take a picture for $1." And her friend decided to take a picture without paying him that $1. And another short tragic story is that she was stabbed to death right in front of about a few hundred tourists. So... Wow. Again, that individual was mentally ill. And I'm not saying that every mentally ill individual has a violent streak in them, but I think the general public is so out of touch with someone with mental illness that it's unfathomable. So the sky is kind of the limit to what can possibly happen in a negative situation.
Right. And I think you bring up a very important point, Guy, about empathy and the lack of empathy that is going on in our world today. And the people that I've dealt with, the family members that I've dealt with that have a loved one that's mentally ill, they always say the same thing. I had no idea how hard this is until it happened to me. And I didn't care about anybody with mental illness. I didn't care about their rights or what was going on with them or anything about them. But when my loved one got mentally ill or received mental illness, then I really cared, and now my heart is breaking, and now I want to work on it. Now it's a project, and now it's important to me. But the issue is that most people turn the other way. And I feel like, it becomes very, very important to our society when somebody with mental illness does something violent. But what we know from the research is that most mental health disorders are not linked to violence. So what we hear in the media is a lot about violence and mental illness. But what we know as a field of psychology, is that mental health disorder, mental health diagnosis, is not correlated usually with violence, right? So criminal tendencies are correlated with violence. But people with schizophrenia, people with all of these disorders in terms of psychoses, they're not necessarily more violent. But it is very important what you're talking about to be acknowledged. It is a human, need to be acknowledged, even if you're struggling with mental illness. And I feel like triggering people that are having a really, really hard time by not acknowledging them, by oppressing them, by making them invisible, it is a trigger. And we never know what is going on for somebody. We never know what they're capable of. Every person that I've ever dealt with is capable of harming another person, given the right circumstances. Every person is. And so I think we have to be very careful about the way we're treating people. We do have to look them in the eye. We do have to acknowledge them, even if they're bothering us, as we would anyone else. And that is what I learned. One of the most important lessons that I learned in the prison is that people always used to ask me, "Don't you feel scared? Don't you feel scared going to work in the prison? Aren't you scared? Aren't they going to hurt you?" And I always said the same thing. My experience is that all I need is respect for another person, and they will act safely. I'm not saying they won't call me names. I'm not saying that they won't lose their temper. I'm saying that if I am respectful of another person, regardless of what is going on for them, my experience has been that they are not threatening towards me. And I feel like that is the fundamental ticket forward, is just pure humanity and respect, that we have to acknowledge other people. We have to tell the truth about what is going on. And what is going on is that we're not serving a population in need in this country as well as we could be. You know?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That's very, very, very well put and very heartfelt. And
Yes.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, it's funny because we can talk about this until the cows come home.
That's right.
Yeah, but ultimately, empathy. I mean, just treating your fellow we're all different, and mental illness is it's when you break your leg, you go to the doctor, he resets your leg. If you have surgery, we can you identify the problem, they cut you open and they fix you and all that kind of good stuff. But mental illness is not something that you can see. No. And you're right, in regards to what you said earlier. I totally agree with you in regards. I mean, depending on what race you are, it doesn't help.
That's right.
Being a supermodel doesn't help. Being a star football player with mental illness doesn't help, because we're all stereotyped into these little boxes that, in our minds, make sense. 2 + 2 is 4. Well, and obviously in life, based on this long, awesome conversation we've had, 2 + 2 is clearly 7.
Right, that's right. And mental illness, you never get a free ride through life saying that you're never going to be mentally ill. Mental illness is the great equalizer. It can happen to anyone at any time for any reason. It depends on so many different things. And I feel like so many times we say to ourselves, well, that's not going to happen to me. I don't have to worry about that. That's not going to happen to my loved one. I don't have to worry about that. It actually does happen. It does happen when you least expect it. And for that reason, empathy is key, because we have to be prepared that we are no better than anyone else. Regardless of what situation is going on, we're no better. And we never, ever know. And when we have our moment of clinical depression, when we have our moment of suicidality, thoughts about wanting to hurt somebody else, when we have our moment, we hope that someone will respond to us fairly, that someone will take care of us, that someone will reach out a hand for us. Because if we do that for other people, and it takes each person doing it daily, one step at a time, one person at a time, if we do it for other people, they will do it for us. And this, slowly the cogwheels will change. But if we don't individually do it, we don't set role modeling for other people. Other people don't see us doing it. Why would they do it? Right? Somebody has to start first. And I think we have started in our country. We really have said we have a problem. We really have said we need to do something about it. And we're really trying to figure it out. But it's a big, big change. And I feel like empathy is the answer. I feel like empathy across the board is violence prevention.
Agreed.
In one word.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for showing up at the Guy Boudreaux Radio show.
I just wanted to say, Guy, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you. It really has been a pleasure, and I feel like this is so important, and I'm so happy you're this brave. I really am.
Well, I want to thank you. I appreciate that, but I want to thank you.
You're welcome.
Once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us here at the Guy Boudreaux Radio show. This is Anything and Everything. And I'd like to leave you with one simple message. Never underestimate the power of hello. I'm Guy Boudreaux. Have a blessed week.
I felt you kiss me in a dream. Ask myself, what does this mean? Ooh, when could it come true? I still can hear those words you said, playing like a record inside my head. Yes, they do. Your little words so sweet, but now that you're gone from me, is it supposed to be still hanging around? I made a bad mistake when I let you get away, but somehow you're here. Somehow you're here to stay. Strange as it sounds. Your love is haunting me. I can't break free. Like you're right here with me. Your love is haunting me. I can't break free. You're still around, yeah. Shabba-ba-doo-ba-doo-bang. Oh. Shabba-ba-doo-ba-doo.